Yes, so I will. So is it okay now in terms of the like boxes? I don't hear anything, so I assume
Yes,
yes.
yes, all good.
Okay, okay. Um, okay, so my talk today, as Kat already mentioned, will be about the question of tailoring to the audience. And yeah, basing this kind of idea on the ethics of argumentation connected to vegan advocacy. Um, so to give you a short overview of the purpose of this presentation, and maybe also to mention that this presentation is based on a paper that I've recently published with a very similar name, so it should be easy to find. It's also open access if you're interested. You can even have a look there for more detailed arguments. But generally speaking, the purpose is to question a very common strategy in vegan activism, which is basically to tailor to the audience, do whatever works to persuade people to go vegan. And as I argue in this paper, and I will explain more why I think that is the case, this often means that activists would have to tailor to environmental arguments or health arguments and not emphasize animal suffering. And based on that, I suggest kind of 5 problematic consequences that come with the tailoring approach. So for the structure of this talk, I will start by presenting you the conceptual framework very briefly, so you know what I mean by the central, like the keywords. So I will explain what I mean by vegan activism as a deliberative form of activism, and also explain briefly what I mean by tailored advocacy precisely. In the second part, I will explain why I think that tailored advocacy entails a neglect of animal suffering, and that is primarily connected to what has been identified as meat-related cognitive dissonance. And in the third and probably kind of most important part, I will then point out the 5 problems that I see with the tailoring approach. So I will start now with the conceptual framework. So in the paper, I focus on what I call deliberative activism. It's actually a concept I've developed in a different paper, and it's something that is it's a very unique kind of activism, which is anchored in deliberative democratic framework. So basically, what it means is that activism does not consist, as you know, as we often think, only in boycotts or boycotts, which has been called ethical consumerism. So we boycott certain maybe companies, or we don't buy certain things in order to express our views. But I suggest that activism, or I mean, of course, there's also violent activism and all kinds of, rescue actions and so forth. But I suggest that maybe a more even effective form of activism can be anchored in deliberation. So basically, what it means is to engage with people deliberatively, giving them reasons why they should go vegan, and justifying our claims as well, and then also engaging with counter arguments, which are likely to come as well. So basically, the whole kind of deliberative idea of being respectful and engaging with each other. So the next key concept that I use in the paper is tailored advocacy. So what I mean by this is basically the idea that vegan advocacy should align with whatever works best with the audience. And according to research in different areas such as psychology or sociology, it has been found that such tailoring approaches should then kind of focus on pre-existing values of the people we speak with, and then frame the message according to those values. And in the case of vegan advocacy, I suggest this can focus on the three central motives that are commonly used for veganism. And a recent paper by Deborah Calte has identified those based on also empirical research. She identifies more than those three, but those are the kind of major ones. So according to Calte, we have, of course, animal suffering is a major motivator for those who are vegan. Then environmental concerns as well as health concerns are also pretty high on the list. So then what that means in terms of tailored advocacy is that climate framing would then take place for, an audience with kind of environmental pre-existing values like climate conscious people, for example. And similarly, health framing would then be applied to people that are very conscious about health issues like health workers or organizations concerned with public health and so forth. And this kind of tailoring strategy has been shown to be quite effective. So that's also something research has found, not only, of course, for meat-related kind of arguments, but also more generally speaking. And so I think one might question maybe why not just, use all three arguments if, just to be on the safe side so we can cover everyone's pre-existing values. But here there have been raised some concerns about the kind of, pragmatic feasibility of this approach, because oftentimes, well, very simply speaking, we have time constraints when we think about deliberative forms of activism, where we maybe have a talk that we can give to an NGO or even a group of people more informally, or just engage with them maybe in the context of a demonstration or any kind of context you might want to think of. But usually there are some time constraints that limit what we can kind of convey in that time frame. And there are two other reasons that kind of make it difficult to focus on more than just one argument. And the one is that Wren and Johnson have identified as cognitive overload. So they found that, people are kind of confronted basically with too many different motives for, veganism, then it's too much. And then also they might experience a collapse, what they call a collapse of compassion. So they might just simply tune out. And it's also something that analytics have emphasized quite strongly, that it's much, much better and effective to focus just on one message, have like a clear motive, and then kind of target that to the audience. So in practice, as I will argue in more detail in the following, that means more emphasis on environmental and health arguments and less emphasis on animal suffering. And the main reason for that is, as I will explain, meat-related cognitive dissonance, or you can maybe even just relate to this idea based on, experience, that people are very unlikely to want to hear about animal suffering and, being kind of implicitly accused to contribute to that by their eating habits. So I will now go into a bit more detail about why I think that tailored advocacy implies a neglect of animal suffering. So this idea of meat-related cognitive dissonance has been proposed by Rosgerber and Rosenfeld, and it's kind of based on this quite famous idea of cognitive dissonance from Leon Festinger. So just in a nutshell, it means that when we have a dissonant state, meaning an inconsistency between values that we hold dear and maybe our behavior, then that causes an aversive arousal, he calls it, which is a very unpleasant emotional state, and that usually triggers some kind of dissonance reduction mechanisms. And Rosgerber and Rosenfeld had the idea to apply this cognitive dissonance research on yeah, on eating meat, because clearly there is a pretty strong inconsistency between the value that many people hold dear, which is they care about animals. Most people don't want to harm animals or see them harms or even be, accused to contribute to animal suffering. And yet consuming animal products is a habit that they have. So there is a clear inconsistency. And Roscoe and Rosenfeld have kind of argued that this is a form of dissonance, because it causes a state of psychological discomfort, similar to this aversive arousal that Festinger has identified, and then also triggers like a diverse range of avoidance mechanisms. So most famously, there are the four N's. So it means basically that we tell ourselves that, when we experience maybe this psychological discomfort, but, it's not so bad because, meat consumption is normal. Everyone does it. It's also natural. People have been doing it for ages. It's necessary even because without meat, we can't get enough protein. It's also nice. So it's often associated, like having a nice barbecue outside with friends. So it's a very kind of pleasant association that people have with meat consumption. And um, importantly, these are kind of very reflexive and automatic rationalizations. So it's like a conscious effort to, yeah, to reduce this dissonance, but it comes very naturally to us, because these kind of four ends are also culturally quite strongly embedded. So what does it mean for vegan advocacy? And that's where we come back to the core of the paper. I think that, if we take this meat-related cognitive dissonance seriously, which I think it's very plausible that, this is something that actually happens a lot, um, that means that, we will easily, or most people will easily kind of, when they have their dissonance triggered, let's say by an activist talking about animal suffering, connecting it to their meat eating habits, they will experience dissonance, and that will just simply trigger avoidance mechanisms like the four N's. There are like other kinds of rationalizations, or simply just, shutting out arguments and tuning out. So in that sense, I suggest that the arguments that are focused on animal suffering are often unlikely to qualify as tailored, because there will rarely be an audience where, these arguments will land strongly, where they're like, and if there are already pre-existing values kind of connected to protecting animals in that sense of, of also eating habits, then it's also less kind of crucial to convince that audience, because they're already kind of likely to, yeah, to care for animals and to adopt a vegan diet probably. So if you accept this kind of conclusion that I suggest, that tailored advocacy tends to focus at least significantly more on environmental and health arguments and tends to neglect animal suffering. There are 5 distinct problems that I see with this approach, and that I develop in more detail now in the third part. And I should probably also, just to clarify, so I'm not suggesting here in the paper that these problems will necessarily and in every single case occur. They're more like risks that I think are pretty likely. But of course, everyone is different and people might react differently. So it's not like a 100% kind of scenario where I'm claiming that this is a necessary consequence. It's more of a risk that I identify. Okay, so to give you an overview before going into detail about each of these objections, I suggest that tailored advocacy can objectify animals, so contribute to their perception as objectified beings. It can also, based on that, imply denial of their personhood, which is something a lot of animal ethicists argue for. It's something that we should attribute to animals, but then I think, tailored advocacy in that sense could imply a denial of that personhood. It can also reinforce our conception of animals as property, furthermore, expose animals to future harm. And finally, it can, I think, create a hierarchy of the moral worth so that it's kind of neglecting or even negating intrinsic value of all animals. So this is just in a nutshell. And so most of these kind of problems are also related to another, as I will hopefully make clear in the following. So they're not like separate in the sense that, each kind of consequence follows independently, but they're quite connected, I think. So the first problematic consequence of tailored advocacy, and remember, so by tailored advocacy, I always mean advocacy kind of excluding or negating or neglecting animal suffering. So the first kind of problematic consequence that I see with this approach is potential objectification of animals. And like more generally speaking, this idea of objectification has been discussed primarily in like feminist ethics, for example, by Papadaki, who argues that, if you objectify someone, then they're being treated as mere means to other ends. And this also implies a failure to attribute intrinsic value to those beings. And then quite interestingly, it has been argued by Roberts that objectification can occur through communication, so speech, writing, images. So really it's a matter of how we represent someone. And I think this is particularly relevant when we think about animal advocacy because they do not advocate for themselves. It's always some kind of human representative in a sense. And therefore, I think it's particularly helpful to have this kind of categorization that objectification can occur also through someone else's kind of speech and kind of writing or even, images. And also very important is the view that objectification can occur without intent. So Papadaki has argued that objectification is not in all cases intentional, so that the objectifier does not always have to have the intention to objectify the other person, but really it can even happen, for a very well-meaning person to objectify someone. And that is also something I think is quite crucial when we talk about, vegan activists, because, I mean, obviously they don't want to objectify animals, but it can still happen if they, as I suggest, use the more tailored advocacy approach. Okay, so then what does it mean concretely for tailored advocacy when we talk about objectification? So again, if we assume that it means that veganism is justified primarily in environmental or health motivations, then for the people that we try to convince with these arguments, not eating animal products becomes justified not by their suffering, but by these other reasons. And this means that animals become an end towards other means, become means to other ends. So they are not the ends in themselves. Why would one become vegan? But not consuming animal products becomes a mean to protecting the environment or improving your health. And so my point is that if in this like advocacy, deliberative advocacy context, the animals are only ever mentioned in relation to these other ends or other motives, and there's no attribution of their intrinsic value, I think it kind of ticks a lot of boxes for objectifying them. So so that they are perceived as mere means to other ends. The second problematic consequence that I see with tailored advocacy is that and this is also kind of tied to the objectification issue, and that it can imply a denial of personhood. So generally speaking, personhood means that someone is worthy of more consideration and is therefore also capable of being wronged. And traditionally, this kind of personhood attribution has been limited to humans, which goes back to Kant, who has famously proposed that animals are things and only humans are persons. And as you can see in the quote, he even says that, animals are rational and we can deal and dispose with them at our discretion. And so this kind of view has been quite influential, I think, on how people have been perceiving the difference between human and non-human animals as well. And of course, it has been challenged, I would say, like quite strongly by Gary Francione, who has argued that we must kind of extend personhood to animals, because that would then also, like from a legal perspective, allow us to protect their morally relevant interests, such as not being harmed. And as I mentioned, I think this depersonalization, or kind of non-attributing personhood to animals, is tied also to potential objectification mechanisms, because as Lowland et al. Have shown that there is empirical evidence for this connection. So once we objectify someone, it's very likely that we also depersonalize them. So we deny their personhood. We, in particular, kind of attribute reduced cognitive capacities to them and reduce moral worth. So as a result, when we apply this to animals, we can, I think, see a connection between objectification and depersonalization as well. And I think there's a third kind of problematic component tied to those two, which is that both objectification and depersonalization can also reinforce the property status of non-human animals. And I should maybe also say that I use the term animals to mean non-human animals, but I sometimes I mix those two just for the sake of convenience. So just as a disclaimer. So the third problematic consequence that I see resulting from tailored advocacy is reinforcement of property status. And this is, I think, quite problematic because it's already a very kind of pervasive view in our societies that animals are properties. You can just think of, our everyday language when we talk about dog or cat owners. So we own these animals. And also the legal status of most animals is chattel property. So that clearly indicates that they are property. And for Francione, this property status is really at the root of animal mistreatment, because even if we try to improve animal welfare through laws, for example, the property status kind of automatically prohibits that there is actual welfare for the animals, because it will automatically prioritize the interests of owners over the interests of the property of the animals. This view has also been challenged, for example, by Alistair Cochrane. And I will not go into detail about this debate, but either way, I think the point remains that the property status remains problematic. So why do I think that tailored advocacy reinforces property status? So again, it relates to the other kind of problems already mentioned. So once we think of animals as objectified beings, seeing them as means to other ends, not as ends in themselves, they become kind of in the view of, let's say, the audience who is confronted with these arguments, they might like implicitly make a connection between the functional similarity between being property and being means to other ends, because that's what property is. So property is, it's not a mere means to other ends, but it is a means to other ends. And so in the audience perception, then this kind of functional similarity between, being an object and being property, it's very close. So I think that it becomes quite strengthening for this perception of animals as property if we only see them as means to other ends. And it's particularly, I think, likely to happen because there's already this very widespread view of animals as property. So that would just be reinforcing it even more. Sorry. Um, The fourth problematic consequence that I see with tailored advocacy is, it relates to future harm, and it's again because um, if veganism is tied only to motives other than animals, then it becomes also meaningful and motivational for, those people who are convinced by these reasons in relation to those other motives, environmental or health motives, but not in relation to animal suffering. And that means that, let's say, if underlying motivations, like let's say someone is motivated for health reasons or for environmental reasons, if these kind of motivations are resolved, then there is not really a good reason for the person to stay vegan. And I will explain a bit more what I mean by this. Um, so, yeah, in a bizarre way, we can say that in the case of tailored advocacy, which is not focusing on animal suffering, we can say that the appeal of veganism becomes really tied to the persistence of the health and environmental problems that have motivated adopting a vegan lifestyle in the first place. But with both health and environment, I think there are there are good reasons to assume that there will be some kind of progress that might make these problems maybe less salient than they are at this point. So let's say if someone is persuaded to go vegan for environmental reasons, and then due to increasing climate change research, we can find a way to cap methane emissions, for example, which are one of the major animal husbandry impacts on the environment. Then that person would not have a strong incentive to stay vegan at this point because, the initial reason is kind of resolved. And we can think of similar kind of scenarios for, diet-related illnesses. So it's quite well proven at this point that, consuming high amounts of animal products can lead to high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, or even certain forms of cancer. But with all medical things, there is always hope for progress. So we can think and hope for, vaccinations or novel treatments that can help, fight these illnesses. And partially we already have medication, for example. So I don't think it's super far-fetched to assume that at some point maybe diet-related illnesses can be really well managed through other forms rather than going vegan. So then for that person who has been convinced to go vegan for health reasons, the motivation would kind of be significantly reduced, at least, to stay vegan. So then animals become, in those future scenarios, quite vulnerable to to renewed exploitation. Now, the last consequence that I see resulting potentially from tailored advocacy is that it can lead to a hierarchization of the moral worth of different animal species. So once again, it relates back to this idea that if animals are portrayed as means to specific other ends, but not as ends in themselves, then also their value or their what I call protection worthiness is kind of evaluated relative to those ends, but not in terms of the animals themselves. I will explain a bit more concretely what I mean by this by way of example. So let's assume that a vegan activist is using environmental tailoring because it fits the audience. So then a person becomes vegan for environmental reasons. But from that standpoint, and still quite, plausibly, they may still, buy leather products, for example, because these are seen as environmentally preferable to synthetic materials. Then including, a kind of lessening the protection worthiness of cows whose skin would be used for the leather, because from the point of view of, going for the end, the goal of, protecting the environment, it's justified in a way to use leather products, which wouldn't have been the case if, the argument would have made in terms of animal suffering, because then clearly you wouldn't use leather. The same kind of reasoning can be applied to health tailoring. So vegan activist talks to, let's say, an acquaintance who's very health conscious and convinces them to go vegan for health reasons. Then that person would very likely, and I think justifiably in that case, continue to consume fish, let's say, because it's quite healthy. It contains healthy omega acids. And so it would be really hard to justify not eating fish from that perspective. And so fish become kind of less protection worthy animals for that person, because in terms of their own end, which is their health improvement, the fish, well, it makes more sense to eat them than not. So this kind of, I think, is also quite problematic because it kind of negates the whole idea of, the animal rights movement, that like all animals matter and that animals have inherent worth. But in that case, it's clear that animals don't have inherent worth, or not all species have the same. So it's really dependent on how they relate to whatever goal you have. So those are the 5 problems that I see potentially arising from tailored advocacy. So I will conclude with a short summary. So basically what I have argued is that tailored advocacy appears attractive, and I think it is quite plausible that, so many animal ethics scholars and animal activist researchers favor this approach, because it has been shown to be effective in general, also in other fields like even advertising and so forth, that, if you tailor like your message to whatever the audience has in terms of pre-existing values, then that it's likely to be effective in terms of persuading them. But so yeah, so I get why it's attractive and why people kind of endorse it. And another reason is also that it can avoid meat-related cognitive dissonance quite easily, in the specific sense of vegan advocacy now. So I think it's a huge advantage. So what my goal is in this paper is not to discredit tailored advocacy wholesale, but to point out that it has, I think, quite significant risks that are currently not really, I think, very much in the focus of those debates. So to repeat briefly again, so it can lead to objectification of animals, using them and seeing them as mere means to other ends, imply denial of their personhood, reinforce our perception of animals as property, even expose them to future harm, and lastly, include a hierarchy of more worse between different animal species, depending on how they relate to whatever motive one has. And so maybe a bit disappointingly, in the paper, I can't really give a clear recommendation what kind of, argumentative strategy is in the end better. I think, like, given those five problematic consequences, that ideally animal suffering should be the focus, because it would avoid, I think, all of these pretty strongly. But then again, we have the issue with meat-related cognitive dissonance, which I think is a real concern. So, I mean, it doesn't really help anything to focus on, what might be the ideal approach, and then it doesn't have any effect because people just tune out. So, from that perspective, I'm just not taking any strong position in the paper as of what is the better approach. But I think just raising awareness that, tailored advocacy can entail maybe more problematic consequences than are, commonly acknowledged. I was hoping that's already a quite valuable kind of contribution. And it also points, I think, to the need for ideally, finding strategies to addressing dissonance reduction mechanisms, so that, because I think that's really the kind of barrier that stands in the way of, using animal suffering as a motivation. So if there would be some kind of interdisciplinary research endeavor, trying to find strategies for avoiding this kind of dissonance barrier, then I think it would be quite clear that that the tailoring approach might be less ideal. So that's it on my part. Thank you very much for your attention.